My project is titled Racial Shifting, the Appropriation of Métis Identity. And this term, racial shifting, was coined in the Globe and Mail article that inspired this project that discussed this appropriation of Métis identity. So to introduce the topic, we know that colonialism took away Aboriginal title and Indigenous rights and sought to assimilate Indigenous peoples through the Indian Act, as well as the residential school system, and more. So today there has been more of a recognition of Indigenous peoples' inherent rights to the land, and we'll talk about Aboriginal title. But these are all contingent if history and connection to the land can be proven, which can be very controversial. So this new movement, racial shifting, is basically white people claiming Indigenous, and particularly Métis, we'll be discussing, heritage in an attempt to gain special rights from the government. So this is threatening the claims of legitimate Indigenous groups of Métis people, and is offensive to the unique culture of Métis people and individual Métis nations across Canada. So a brief history of Métis in Canada. Louis Riel is the founding father of the Métis Nation, and this really began in Manitoba in the Red River settlement, and he protected the land from the Hudson's Bay Company, who wanted exclusive hunting rights and use of the land. Before Louis Riel, Métis people, originally the children of settlers and Indigenous women, weren't viewed as wholly Indigenous and didn't have the same rights as Indigenous people. So he had a really extensive political career across Canada, working for the rights of Métis Indigenous people, and having them become unified in distinct Métis groups. And he was actually executed, but again, he's still considered the father of the Métis Nation in Canada. So the Indian Act of 1876, as mentioned earlier, really stripped away some of those rights. There weren't many, but these rights were essential to Indigenous people, including exemption from taxes and more. So for example, if an Indigenous person married a non-Indigenous person, they lost their right to Indigenous status. And again, if they moved off of the reserve, the same thing happened. So it really was very oppressive. So today, there is recognition of Métis people as Indigenous in the Constitution Act, Section 35, which is really important for claiming certain Indigenous rights. And there are actually potential benefits to Métis identity that are allocated. These include special scholarships for various institutions, and jobs jobs that are reserved for Métis people. So in terms of resource development of Métis nations, when we talk about land ownership, as we think of it, is usually considered fee simple ownership. And for example, if I were to buy a business to run, I would get a mortgage from the bank, and the bank could be assured that if I didn't pay back my loan, they could foreclose the business and sell it for their own. However, in Indigenous communities, all land, if surrendered by the Indigenous people, has to be surrendered to the Crown. So basically, the banks are not very willing to lend money because they can't foreclose that land, because that land goes back to the government. So they have nothing to hold the loan to. So they're very hesitant to lend, which really prevents a lot of resource development. So Aboriginal title is basically an Aboriginal claim to the land that needs historical context and a current context as well. It has to be proven in court, but it actually allows the Indigenous group to reclaim that land as their own. So some examples are the Nisga'a Treaty of 2000, which surrounded logging industry in BC and a lot of forestry there, and the Nisga'a Nation was granted that land, and they could run that logging business. And R.V. Powley 2003. So that determines the Powley test, which we'll talk about in a moment. But basically, it allowed Métis communities to gain specific hunting and fishing rights reserved just for their community. So ties to the land. So Aboriginal title is not just about getting that land for resource exploitation, but it's also for the re-inhabitation of the land. So the reserves nowadays are significantly cut back from how they used to be, and they're usually on very barren land that isn't sustainable. So this allows better resource development, But also, Indigenous and Métis identity is often associated with the land, and this includes specific cultural and spiritual practices. So this is why when Métis were recognized as a distinct group, and there are distinct groups of Métis people, this was really important so they could gain back some of those traditional lands and really start those spiritual practices over again. So Métis nations and Indigenous nations across Canada have the right to self-government. So the Pali test, as I mentioned earlier, this establishes a community of individual rights and if that self-government can come into play. So this quote here is from a leader of a Métis nation in Canada. And he's basically saying that we're going to determine who the members are. So in this case, Indigenous people are taking over to prevent this racial shifting. And communities are to have their own constitutions. So in terms of their own constitutions, so what are the economic implications? So these Métis nations can trade with Canadian companies, but they're exempt from taxes. And people in independent nations do still have access to Canadian healthcare systems. So basically, the charter of the Canadian Charter does still apply to Métis nations. So although they can have their own constitutions and their own rights and freedoms, they have to fit within the Canadian Charter. It's imposed on them. So the rights and freedoms are protected, but they're also imposed on the communities that might not necessarily identify the same way. For Métis corporations, land ownership and use are subject to the same environmental standards as private or government corporations. However, this is almost seen as less of an issue because, again, Indigenous peoples have greater ties to land and usually a better understanding and appreciation of sustainable practices. Again, profits are exempt from taxes, and the distribution of profits and the laws surrounding that are, again, fall within the Canadian Constitution and Charter. So there's external regulation from, again, the Canadian Constitution, and there's also internal regulation from the systems within that group, including the chiefs or any financial officers of the nation. So some of the legal implications for someone claiming Métis heritage. I have that picture. An example is author Joseph Boyden, a Canadian author who claimed Indigenous heritage, and it was very controversial at first. People were very upset because he didn't seem to have any legitimate proof, but he never proved his Indigenous heritage in court. However, he gave the press a lot of information that seemed to satisfy people that he truly did have Indigenous heritage and wasn't just claiming that to boost his sales or something along those lines. So again, the court can establish if someone has Métis heritage, and that extent, whether the heritage is a good enough extent for a resource or benefit claim, for example, one of those jobs, can be determined by a judge, which again is very controversial. In terms of employment law, whether saving spots only for Indigenous people is actually legal, technically, is that a form of discrimination because you're discriminating against non-Indigenous people? It's not. It's subject to the same laws as affirmative action, which is when jobs are reserved for women only. So some of those employment standards make it possible for the jobs to be reserved for Métis people only. And that's not a form of discrimination that's prosecutable by someone who's non-Indigenous. So is claiming Métis identity, again, this racial shifting, a form of prosecutable racism? That really depends on the extent of the claim, and judges have to look at the intent behind it as well. So if someone, for example, is applying for a scholarship and claiming Métis identity illegitimately, they need to look at the intent. Was it solely for the money, or was it an attempt to discriminate against Métis individuals? And there haven't been any really significant cases in the courts discussing this. So it'll be interesting to see in the next few years if that comes into play, and then we can have some really interesting examples to look forward using them as reference. But a lot of Métis people find it very offensive, and this kind of racism still rooted in colonialism. Although people are claiming to be Métis, it's not so they can truly understand the culture